Well, a very warm welcome to you all. As Bryony said, my name's Marion Hill. I'm the Learning and Outreach Officer on the Green Pledge project. So I've been slightly seconded over to the Secrets Revealed sort of programme to give a talk about gardens. Some of you who are regulars at the archives may be au fait with the Green Pledge project. If you haven't heard of it, it's a 2-year Heritage Lottery funded project at the archives. It started off in sort of last winter. And as Bryony said, we're kind of exploring, sharing and extending the county's sort of environmental story, if you will. So I'm part of a fairly small team. I'm just going to introduce you to us. There we are. That's obviously last winter, all wrapped up in scarves. In the middle, the lady in the blue jumper, that's our project manager, Christina. You can see me, I'm the lady in the grey scarf. I have an apprentice to the project, who's the chap on the far left, a project archivist who's busy working through all sorts of environmental records which haven't been catalogued since the 80s. They've been waiting patiently all that time. So that's Jenny in the green. And on the far right is Hannah, who's our project officer. So you'll see us bobbing around at the archives over the next couple of years. So do say hello. What on earth are we talking about when we say the environmental collections? There isn't any helpful collection called environmental, really. It's a very, very broad umbrella encompassing a huge variety of records. So, I mean, for example, I put here, there's photographs, there's drawings, there's, maps and plans, all sorts of material, council minutes, minutes from all sorts of institutions, organisations, membership societies, and so on, that all help to tell the story of how Gloucestershire has interacted with its environment. So what are we doing? We are shaping the programme of events, outreach and touring and online exhibition through a programme of public consultation, which took place at the beginning of the project, and that enabled us to sort of focus in on particular themes that were of interest to people in Gloucestershire. Understandably, flooding came fairly high up the list because we were doing the consultation during the winter and it was very much at the forefront of people's minds. Other key themes include changing landscapes, pollution, ecology, biodiversity, and so on. So let's make a start then on the actual talk. So this isn't some ancient document, it's quite recent really. It's only from 1970. Lovely chap called Albert Batty, just picking some of the raspberries he's grown in a garden he's obviously very, very proud of. It's got a lovely picture of his front garden also bursting with beautiful roses as well. And I think this sort of image is actually quite rare in archive collections due to the way they're put together. It quite often can be that quite a large number of the records actually relate to, the great and the good, and the kind of ordinary lives and ordinary stories are not so evident. So it's lovely actually to find pictures like this. So, happily, one of the aspects of the project is actually to address gaps like this in the story, and we are going around collecting oral histories and other material to help sort of tell that broader environmental story. So anyway, so this picture brings us nicely onto today's talk, where we're going to be looking at gardens and growing in the county. So with the help of Brian, you can have a show of hands. Who likes growing things or has a garden? Have we got a good show of hands? I can see. Oh, a digital hand is very helpful. Thank you, Diana and Ian and others. Lovely. Oh, that's a lovely, large and growing number there. Wonderful. Lucky you. I know not everyone is able to have that, but any small amount of green is wonderful. Even if it's window boxes. I take huge pleasure in my basil plant, which I haven't managed to kill, so I'm very pleased with that in my kitchen. Would any of you be willing to come off mute and tell me why you like growing things or why you enjoy having a garden? Anyone feeling brave? I think Brian is because we're going to nominate someone who raises their hand. Is that Diana? Are you happy to talk to us?
Yes, I love gardening because I find it so peaceful. I do. When you're out in the garden, you forget everything else, and all your worries just completely disappear, and you're in another world.
That's absolutely wonderful. So it brings you peace. That's absolutely fabulous. Thank you, Diana. Does anybody else want to throw out any ideas about why they grow or enjoy growing? Oh, Councillor Cody, is that?
Hello, thank you for doing the talk. Yeah, for me, it's helping biodiversity in nature, and there's also an element of 0 food miles and really fresh things.
Fabulous, thank you. Shall we have one more? Three's
I
the
would
magic
say
number.
I would say, can you hear me?
Hello, is
Hello?
that Sue James? Yes, go ahead.
I would say that it sort of moves at your own pace. So whatever you do, it kind of gives the same back, and you can go out there and it kind of like responds to you, and yeah, so there's always something going on and happening from that you might have left it a long time, but there's still there.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I think that's wonderful. Though I've certainly got some of those ideas, and I think the idea that it sort of moves along with you, I think is really lovely. Thank you all very much for sharing. I'm sorry I couldn't catch all of them. If you feel compelled to add something else, please feel free to do that in the chat, but we must move along with the talk itself. So for me, on my list, I got as far as, I certainly agree about the getting food to eat. There's nothing more satisfying than eating something that you've managed to grow with your own hands, be it as simple as herbs, but fruit and veg if you can. For pleasure, absolutely, I had that very high up my list. It's a very de-stressing thing, just being out in nature, like that quote up there, which is attributed to Alfred Austin, but it's not certain. But anyway, getting your hands in the soil, there's something wonderful about connecting like that with nature. Just being in a pleasant environment, even if it's just a window box, just that green does do a lot for us, as opposed to being in a concrete urban environment. It's creative. When you think about, if you're a garden visitor, then you know that some of the great and fabulous gardens there are in Gloucestershire, someone has put a great deal of thought and creativity and imagination into making them beautiful. I think learning is in there. I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn about different plants. You put something in one part of the garden, doesn't grow, you either look online, you ask someone, you move it somewhere else, and you can build your knowledge through your time in your garden. And teaching. I've got a little girl and we've just planted her first veg patch, and she's learning about having to look after that, and so she's enjoying that. But yes, and of course, with an environmental project in mind, it is to encourage nature. So I couldn't agree more with the comment about that, supporting biodiversity, encouraging the bees, and so on. So it's a very long and varied list. Why perhaps that is a national obsession, gardening. But so today we're thinking more about kind of the different purposes of gardens. So more sort of, why does your garden grow rather than how does your garden grow? I am not an expert. I mean, I enjoy gardens, but I'm definitely not not great on the hows. But we're going to look a little bit more at why gardens came about and what different kinds of gardens we have in Gloucestershire. So in time-honoured fashion for talks given in archives, we're going to go right back to the beginning and find the first reference we can to a garden in the Gloucestershire record. So that one appears in a deed. Often the oldest documents are deeds. And this describes a gift of property and land made by the Convent of Holy Trinity of Cardon, which is what we now know as Caen in northern France. And it was made to William, son of Nigel Kingscote. So if you are living in Gloucester, you know Gloucestershire well, you'll know it's one of the county's oldest families. And it was granted by the abbess of the convent in late 12th or early 13th century. And it includes a house in Avening with an apple orchard. And if you look on line 4, where it's underlined, you can see it's slightly misspelt, but it's a pomarium. It's misspelt as a pomarium, and a garden, which is the word orto, the last word that you can see in those few that I've underlined there. Orto, which is for hortus. So that's for garden. So probably comes to as no surprise to those of you who are local to learn that orchards have been in Gloucestershire for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think really it's to do with the climate. Well, historically at least, the mild British climate is very, very good for their growing season, which runs from sort of April to October. So it's very well suited to apple growing because it gives them a very slow period and long period of time to fully mature into kind of sort of complex flavors. So back in the day, not only did orchards provide cider for people, they were also they're perfect pollinators, have been, still are. And fruit trees also age quite quickly, and that creates deadwood habitats that recycle nutrients back into the soil. And also orchards generally also contain grasses and shrubs and mosses and wildflowers, so they can support quite a wide range of wildlife. So here in the green team, we think they're wonderful. Now, let's move on. There's the slide going to move on. It's a bit slow. There we are. You should see a diagram of some Gloucestershire orchards. In the course of our research for the project, we came across a wonderful notebook. It's slightly mysterious because I don't know exactly who created it, but someone who was responsible for planting orchards across Gloucestershire in the early part of the 20th century. You can see on the slide the records run from 07 to 27. But very sadly, in the last 50 years or so, about 3/4 of Gloucestershire's orchards, which this chap would have known, have now gone, completely been disappeared from the landscape. And it's due to changes in agriculture, changes in the way supermarkets source their fruit, and so on. So these are now sadly increasingly rare. But all is not lost, though. We have the Gloucestershire Orchard Trust, and they're working very hard to conserve traditional orchards and the wildlife habitats that they can offer. They're also trying to keep going the 100+ apple varieties and 120 odd Perry pears that are unique to Gloucestershire. So in the garden at the Heritage Hub, I don't know if you've all been, but if you haven't, there's a lovely garden, quite unusual for an archive service to have its own garden. So if you go in there, you will find the Ashmead kernel tree, and that's one of the heritage varieties that have survived thanks to the Gloucestershire Orchard Trust. So if you're interested in orchards, make a note of that record, and you can come and look up that and take a look and see if the one that's near you is still there or not. You can go around and visit. Now then, let's go back to our medieval era, which is where we really started. This is obviously a picture of Gloucester Cathedral Cloister Garden, as it is now, because funnily enough, pictures from medieval era are few and far between. The garden style back then was really dominated by monasteries and big manor houses, and gardens of this era were typically practical, and they were used for growing food and medicinal herbs. Now, alongside orchards, other fruit and vegetables would have been grown, and there would have typically been fish ponds, and pigeons would have been kept as well. Pigeons were, I wouldn't say revered, but certainly held in higher esteem than they are today. They were kept for their meat, obviously. Their feathers were used for cushions, and their dung was used for fertilizer. So, we pretty much used everything apart from the squeak. So manor houses and medieval gardens often also featured a kind of enclosed secret garden known as the hortus conclusus. And these weren't remotely practical. This was more flights of fancy. This was, raised beds and scented flowers and herbs and plenty of nice sort of shady places to sit. So like the very first lady Diana, who spoke to us about what she liked about a garden. This was a very small pocket of a largely practical garden where you could just sit and enjoy the flowers and the lovely scents in the garden. Now, just thinking about those medicinal herbs that were grown. In medieval times, obviously, it was nothing like the situation that we have now in terms of being able to see a doctor. Most people never saw a doctor. If you were feeling ill, you would likely be treated by either the monks or lay healers who were also skilled in the preparation of herbs. So in monasteries, As I mentioned, there would have been dedicated medicinal herb gardens, but lay healers, they would have gathered plants and herbs that would grow locally, sort of, so things like sage, thyme, wild garlic, elderflower and nettles. Medieval monks, who would have been more educated, they'd have been able to read and follow ancient Greek medicine, and extraordinarily not much changed in terms of the thinking from ancient Greek times right up to that era and beyond. Now, one of the key ideas in ancient Greek medicine is the idea of the body having these 4 humours, they called them, and that they related to the elements. So black bile for earth, yellow bile for fire, phlegm for water, and blood for air. And the idea was that if they were all in balance, all 4 of them perfectly in balance, then you were well and you were healthy. And if there was an imbalance, then you were unwell, and it was up to the herbalist or the monk to work out where the imbalance was and then select the required herbs to restore the balance. That was the thinking. So if you had a fever, there would be a sort of a cooling herb like sage. They used other things like chamomile. That was one that, to some extent, it's still used this way as well, to sort of as to make kind of sedative and digestive infusions. Comfrey to heal wounds, inflammations, and help set broken bones. Right, let's move on. This is no relation, by the way. I'm a hill as well, but I think I may have pointed out that my gardening prowess is limited. So towards the end of the medieval era, interest in growing and gardening began to actually broaden out beyond that sort of top echelon of society. But this is all relatively speaking. The large-scale formal gardens are really still in the hands of the few. But this is an era that saw the beginning of the age of exploration. So you've got sailors setting out around the world, exploring new lands, new trade routes, and bringing home new exciting plant seeds, so non-native plant seeds. And so people were starting to experiment with these. I can't imagine it was that successful if they came from wildly different climates, but nonetheless, there was an appetite for getting in more interesting and diverse plants. But it's not really until Henry VIII comes along, the beginning of the 16th century, that you start to see the beginning of gardens less as practical places for culinary and medicinal growing, and more as symbols of power and prestige. So, just in your mind, hopefully instantly images of Hampton Court Gardens and other large gardens of that era pop into your mind. So on the screen, you can see this is the first kind of proper gardening book with sort of general advice on planting and growing. So this is Tudor era. It's a little bit later than Henry VIII. It's just at the beginning of Elizabeth I's reign. So it's published in 1558. Sadly, we don't have a copy in the archives. This one is at the British Library. But he calls it, and if you can see, a most brief and pleasant treatise teaching how to dress, sow, and set a garden. And it's full of advice sort of from the classical writers, but there are also chapters on the consideration and choosing of good and excellent grounds, the times for sowing and dressing seeds, and setting plants in the garden. And it was the absolute bestseller. It was so popular, it was expanded and republished. And by then you've got the printing press has been introduced, so sharing information about plants and gardening starts to become easier. I do put a note of caution on that, because of course that A, they would have been very, very expensive books, but B, you're still talking about a time when the majority of the population would not have been able to read or afford books like that. But it is the beginning of sharing information through the printed word about gardening and how to do well in your garden. So moving on then, we've got ourselves into the beginning now of the sort of 1600s, and really this is by now a time when sort of gardening fever is in full flow, and the very wealthy are able to sort of commission designs for their gardens and follow the fashions which were coming across from Italy. And at this time, what you're seeing is very regimented gardens, you know, with perfect symmetry, very large terraces, this sort of style. Now, I found this sketch in the papers of the Lloyd Baker family of Hardwicke Court in Gloucester. It's not dated, but it is very much the sort of style that you would have seen in the sort of in the 1600s. So that just gives you an idea, and perhaps it is from them, perhaps it isn't, but it instantly spoke to me of that sort of Italian design of formality and geometry and sort of precision in planting. So hold on to that idea in your head, because later we'll see how things evolved so far from that in terms of garden styles. So staying with Hardwicke Court, while I was looking through their papers, I also came across a sort of shopping list for Hardwicke Court. Again, not dated, but likely sort of late 17th, early 18th century. And I don't know how well you can see it on your screen, but it's a list of trees and flowering shrubs that the family wanted to plant at Hardwicke Court. And it includes mulberries, walnuts, horse chestnuts at the top, where it says of the larger trees. That's sort of divided into 3 sections. Can you see at the very top, it says of the larger trees, then there's a line, a lower section says evergreens, and the bottom section says flowering shrubs. And I mean, just to continue then, they've got, in terms of trees, they've got a medlar, which is a fruit tree which some of you may have heard of and others not. It's sort of gone out of fashion. I think the Romans brought it, but it's a bit of a bore because you have to, after you pick the fruit, then wait a certain amount of time for the fruit to actually ripen. And I think the world is ever less patient with that sort of thing. But there's another one called Lazarole, which is a French-sounding one. I don't know that one. That's about halfway down the large tree list, but certainly not one I've heard of. And then for the evergreens, they have juniper, cypress, and privet, all fairly common still. But it's a very, very long list, and it sort of impressed me in terms of what must have been their knowledge of plants at the time. Just going on down in the flowering shrubs, in case that's a bit illegible if you're on a small screen, I'll just tell you what's on there. There's oleander and rose bay, and slightly ambitiously, there's an olive tree down there as well. And then the slip on the right is just what's written on the reverse of this shopping list, which is instructions to buy 1 or at most 2 of any of the sorts that they have, and also to pick up some nice gooseberries, some yellow gooseberries. So there we are. That's what was going on at Hardwicke. And you may or may not recognise this one if you're a National Trust member. This is Dereham Park. Now, along with having a very well-stocked and varied planting arrangements in your garden, one of the key status symbols from the 17th right up to the 19th century would have been an orangery. And on the slide here, I circled in the large picture where the huge orangery is attached to the main building at Dereham Park. Now, orangery is important because there's such an easy win for showing people that you have a seriously lot of money. A, obviously it's a large building, but B, it was heated. There was a series of flues that would go in to heat it through the winter, so that you could grow citrus plants that otherwise you simply wouldn't have a chance of growing here. So if you could serve citrus fruits in the winter from your orangery, at Dereham Park, that was incredibly flash. The everyman simply couldn't possibly hope to be able to do that. What's unusual about this one is it actually connects, not only is it attached to the house, but there's a connecting door. So I think perhaps the family at the time took a real interest in it and growing there. Repton visited the house about 100 years after this was added. This was added in about 1701. And he said what a great job the orangery did of hiding all the stables and office buildings behind it. So maybe that's why it was a little large, I don't know. But anyway, on the right, you can see how very closely the design of it echoes the orangery at Versailles. And there's just the two for comparison there, side by side. Very, very pretty. But also in this case, quite practical as well as hiding the kind of ugly, boring, everyday buildings behind it. Now then, while we were looking at Dereham, we had a little nose in their accounts as well. And we saw that they certainly were growing lemons there. You can see across the top of the slide, it says Profito dal Giardino. So this is profits from the gardens, and the lemons right there at the top of the list, bringing in several pounds. So that's on the entry up there, 26th of March in 1701, showing a profit of £2.04. So let's see, that buys you quite a lot when you then go shopping. So this is another one of these, well, it's actually not shopping, this is the receipt for seeds purchased for Dereham, and they'd have had to go up to London for those. So they've gone to the orange tree in the Strand. That was obviously where their seed merchant was in the late 17th century. And it shows them ordering trees like the silver fir, Norway fir, and the Scotch fir. Evergreen shrubs like pyracantha and juniper, which we've seen pop up before. And among their ornamental flowers, they've got sweet williams. They've got some medicinal ones like valerian, which can help you sleep, and various culinary herbs. There's thyme and chervil, French sorrel. And then there are some that are simply there because they're beautiful. So they've got Spanish broom and a kind of a hibiscus called Althea frutex. So, and the total for all of those seeds is £2, 6 shillings and 10 pence. So you can see, you know, a few lemons would go a long way in terms of buying up lots of new seeds for the park. So anyone who has visited Dereham knows how very beautiful and extensive the gardens are, and they liked to keep them that way. But nature had different ideas, as you can see here in the receipt for spending on the garden at Dereham Park. 18 shillings paid to Richard Bright for mole catching, and it's been signed off. You can see at the top it says received of Samuel Truman. Now he was the clerk of works and also the rector of Dereham. But this is a large sum of money. This is clearly a lucrative business, making sure moles stayed out of nice large estates and kept their gardens beautiful. I won't go into all the different sorts of traps. They are quite unpleasant, and clearly moles have been a problem. If you look up mole traps, they go right back to Roman times when they had a sort of a nasty sort of drain that the mole would go down and then it would land in a pot and drown. Unpleasant. But as time went on, they refined these traps until the point where they weren't using traps at all. They just used poison, which, although fast and effective in addressing the mole problem, caused problem to the soil. It damaged the soil, and it wasn't, you know, that long before they stopped using strychnine in the soil. But that was problematic for the mole men because the poisons, and the use of poisons, because they used to get their money by showing Samuel Truman or whoever the heads of the moles. It was a per capita payment. But once the poison was used, of course, they would just all disappear. So I think the mole men were probably quite happy when poisons went out of use and they returned to more traditional methods. But as I say, they did well per head, but they also made money from selling the moleskins because they were able to keep and sell on the moleskins. So I think that was definitely a good trade to be in at the time. So moving on a little bit. So as I said, up till about the 16th century or so, religious houses were generally the first port of call for people wanting to get hold of seeds and plants. But once you have the dissolution of monasteries in 1540, church lands, including, you know, orchards and gardens and so on, went into the hands of new owners. And over time, two separate trades developed to serve these new landowners. So you had the seedsmen, who were involved in that international trade in seeds and bulbs, and nurserymen who cultivated those seeds and sold on the plants. Now, initially, as we mentioned, those trades were only set up in London. But as the appetite for remodeling estates grew, more and more seedsmen and nurserymen started to get established outside the capital. And we have here in Gloucestershire, John Jeffreys and Son founded, there was a seed merchant and nurseryman who founded a business in 1795 down here in Cirencester, and stayed in business for about 200 years. So anyway, so this shift brought about the purchase of new and exotic plants sort of within reach of ordinary gardeners locally here in Gloucestershire. You didn't have to traipse all the way up to London. And you can see here on the slide some examples. Actually, it's quite unusual to find organic matter in archive records, but there are actually seeds in that packet in here in the archives. And one of them, the one with just the red stamp on it, is actually, I don't know if you can see it on yours, it's from Marseille. So we know that John Jeffreys was certainly importing internationally his seeds for sale in Gloucestershire. Now then, what we've got here are some sales particulars from the mid 19th century on the left-hand side. Now, if we were at the archives, I'd be saying where you're sitting right now, but obviously you're all at home. But where the Heritage Hub, where the Gloucestershire Archives is now, was once the site of one of these nurseries, and a nursery called Wheeler's. And if any of you know the Heritage Hub well, you know there is a Wheeler room. So that's named after it. And this was a nursery that sold a huge variety of fruit trees and ornamental shrubs. And the poster here on the left-hand side, again, it depends what size screen you're looking at. You can see it's from 1853, and it's showing that they had over 2,000 varieties of apples, pears, apricots, nectarines, peaches and plums, all manner of trees, shrubs and flowers. And I think it's really a testament to the huge knowledge and expertise that the family had built up over many years. And we know that the business was set up over a century before that by James Wheeler. And over on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see it's sort of one of the inside early pages of a publication called The Botanist and Gardener's New Dictionary from 1763, which was authored by James Wheeler. Now, it's clear that what he intended to do was create a kind of useful and accessible gardening guide, but also one that provided his readers with an accessible introduction to what was the cutting edge thinking of sort of at the time of sort of botanical thinking. So this was Linnaean classification, so a system for identifying, naming and classifying organisms. So I've just put that in red so you can see it. So yes, there's all this about, you know, the gardener's calendar and so on, but he really wanted to try and give people a sort of a leg up into that scientific knowledge of the day. So that's rather nice. So to return to the 18th century, the thriving economic sort of the thriving economy of the era was, as I'm sure you all know, underpinned by the transatlantic slave trade. And this, along with a taste for conspicuous consumption, which we've touched on among the landed gentry, led to swathes of ambitious building and remodelling projects in the sort of great estates across Gloucestershire. So one such project was at Doddington Park near Chipping Sodbury. And on the slide is the estate survey commissioned by William Codrington for his manors at Marshfield and Doddington. And the image for Doddington, that's one on the right-hand side, shows his home and the very large surrounding gardens from about 1770. However, when you go further through this very large volume, you can discover right towards the back of it where some of the family's wealth came from. Because after all the pages about lands in Gloucestershire, come 2 pages about their lands over in the Caribbean. So we can see that they owned 3 sugar plantations. 2 of them are on the slide. Going to fit 2 on a slide, but there were 3. One called The Cotton and one called Betty's Hope. And if you visit a website created by University College London, they have something called the Legacies of the British Slave Trade, and you can look up the name Codrington, or any name you care to investigate, and see what lands they owned, how many slaves were attached to that land, and how much was paid out by the government to the owners of that land and those enslaved Africans at the so-called end of slavery. So that's an interesting website to look at. I can put that in the chat at the end. So this money then from those sugar plantations doubtless helped cover the costs of this rather ambitious plan for park and pleasure grounds at Doddington from 1810. And we know that Capability Brown was the designer that was commissioned to remodel the grounds here at Doddington. But we can also see how very far garden style has moved on from when we were looking in the 1600s at the very rigid, formal, geometric layouts. So by now you've got a very natural look with wide rolling lawns, lakes, scattering of trees, beautiful vistas, temples, rotundas, all that sort of thing. And I think it's an absolute stark contrast with those sort of rigid earlier designs. Obviously, this was a very, very large estate, and keeping estates looking beautiful took more than a mole catcher. It took quite the workforce. And this is wonderful. This is a photograph from 1890 of the estate, or the outdoor estate workers at Doddington Park. And interestingly, it's got everybody's name and what their job was. So at that time, just 1890, it was 23 outdoor estate workers there, and among them were 5 gardeners plus a head gardener. So a huge, huge team looking after the gardens. So as time is moving on, I shall speed up. So we've got here, as we move on into the 19th century, evidence of the sort of gentleman scientist at work in their garden. And we know that in the 1890s, so the same sort of era as that plan from Doddington Park, we know that Lindley Blaithwaite, who was related to the family at Dereham Park, he was actually sort of living nearby, was busy in his garden recording the weather and collecting insects and all sorts of other tiny creatures and looking at them under his microscope and making notes about them. So that's what you've got up there on the slide. He mentions that he is following on that first line. It says the families are numbered as in Lamau and Decame's system of botany. I don't know if you can see that in the scarlet writing on the far left. Now that was a classification system, and I was a little bit surprised. I thought, well, by then, why would he not be using Linnaeus? So I actually wrote to the Linnaean Society and said, I don't understand. I thought that was the sort of gold standard. Why would he not be using it? And they said it would depend where he had studied, and that there were various classification systems around. If you studied in Edinburgh under John Hope, you would have followed Linnaeus. If you studied in Paris, you would have followed the Jussieu, and so on and so on. But we do know that he later became a fellow of the Linnaean Society, so perhaps he did change track at some point. Right. Let's move on and think about other types of gardens. So moving on from the very wealthy Victorians with large gardens and all the kit to explore them, we're going to see how things were at the other end of the social spectrum in the 19th century. If you know anything about the Victorians, you'll know they sort of prided themselves on self-improvement and sort of education and godliness, but also on their social conscience. And this is something we very much see at work in the allotment movement. So as people flocked to towns and cities to work in the factories, they left behind their gardens, their growing spaces. And although they did fine work, many were barely able to make ends meet, but they hadn't got enough land to grow the food that they needed. So the allotment movement sort of started to take shape in the 19th century. And this here is an allotment that was established near Primrose Hill, that sort of Lydney area in 1864. And you can see it's divided up into little strips. Each one is named. But as you would know, the allotment movement is alive and kicking and very much still in force. It's certainly still got one in the village where I am in Iron Acton in South Gloss. I will scuttle through now because I can see we're short on time. I'm sure Katie's anxious. These are some allotment rules, basically saying that this is 1869. This one's from Cam Garden Allotments, that you'd lose your allotment if you didn't pay your rent or look after your allotment properly. You had to keep the banks and the ditches in good order. You weren't allowed to build a pigsty without permission, and you certainly couldn't have one if you had had a criminal conviction. So I don't know if it's that draconian today, but that's the 1860s. And just continuing the theme of gardens for social good, the picture here is from Hardwick Reformatory School. It was kind of the alternative provision of its day. The school was opened by Thomas Barwick Lloyd Baker of Hardwick Court in 1852 with the view to trying to reduce juvenile crime. So it was a privately financed initiative, and it was the first of its kind, and it was a model that was copied all over the country later on. So we can be quite proud of that model in Gloucestershire. So the idea was sort of not only to occupy these boys who could have got into trouble, but also to give them some skills and help them obtain work. Now, this here is a plan of Coney Hill Hospital from about 1876 or so. And I think it's quite clear when you see this plan that the Victorians also entirely grasped the therapeutic benefits of gardens when they began to construct the first hospitals to care for people with poor mental health. And they were clearly, far from the first to identify this. Hippocrates in ancient Greece is quoted as having said, "While the physician treats, nature heals." So gardens were typically large landscaped affairs, like I'll show you in the next slide, but they were an integral part of the hospital design or the asylum design. So Gloucestershire's first county asylum was built in 1830, and this second one at Coney Hill was added in 1876. And you can see on the plan where the curved edges are, bottom left and bottom right, those are the lawns. It's very strictly segregated, the men on one side, the women on the other. Where those triangles are, there are airing courts as well, where they were sort of walked around as well. But I think those living there would have really appreciated them. The women, at least, would have been inside doing the laundry and mending and that sort of thing for most of their day. So I think their small portion of the day when they get to go out and enjoy those beautiful gardens, I'm sure was quite a highlight, even if it was not heavily supervised. So there we are. And I've just got some of the men's side, the bottom right-hand photograph there. The men look like they may be playing bowls or something on that side. Right. Moving along then so we've looked at sort of therapeutic gardens and gardens with social and economic uses. Victorians also identified the educational benefits of gardens. So from about the late 19th century, many schools began to set aside an area of the grounds, or they would rent a space near the school where the children could study nature and learn to grow plants and vegetables. And that sort of particularly popular by the 1920s, when it sort of coincided with a very key public agenda around getting fresh air and exercise, and that interest in health and well-being comes about in that early part of the 20th century. And as you can see in the picture on the right, the young girls there in the garden, they certainly seem to be enjoying their time away from the garden. And we also came across this really lovely gardening journal, not from that place. That the slide with the little girls in their garden is from Chalford in the 20s. This is from a chap called Charles Cully at the Church St Boys Council School, it says, from 1914 to 15. And it's really lovely. He clearly adores his time outside. He did lots of beautiful sketches of his tools and of the animals that he saw in the garden. He's cut out and stuck in a little defense of the toad in the garden. And he said, I quite agree with what this slip of paper says. Some people are very cruel to toads and give them most uncommon names. So I thought that was rather sweet. And then later on, this is sort of by the 1950s, we can see evidence that school gardens were still going strong by this stage. There's a letter here, the head teacher's describing the state of the school garden. He's saying the children share a garden between them, working in pairs. One long section is devoted to flowers and is cared for by the girls. The boys provide their own seeds and keep their own produce. And then they share out the rent between them. So the little scrap of paper on the left shows that the allotment was actually just adjacent to the school. And there's an almost illegible note which implies that there were issues with the allotment, as the person who owned part of the land was refusing to sell it to the school. So I don't think it was always plain sailing. No talk on gardening and growing will be complete without reference to the Dig for Victory campaigns, which I'm sure you know about. It was launched by the government during the Second World War to try and help address the shortages of food. So it was encouraging people to just grow and cook simple meals themselves. And there's a wonderful guide telling you what to plant when, so that your vegetable patch will actually give you food all year round. And I think some of these sort of growing clubs and so on that were set up wartime actually continued well after the war. And you see sort of horticultural shows like this going on. This is into the late 1940s. Certainly in the village where I am, we still have a horticultural show going strong in 2024. So I think people quite enjoy that. It sort of brought a kind of little competitive edge to it all. Now, this slide speeds us on into the 21st century. It's a newspaper clipping from the local paper called The Forester from November 2002. And I think what I would say about this is, after Second World War, you've got huge speeding up in urbanization, car ownership, the jet age comes, and all this progress, in inverted commas, comes at a huge cost to the environment. And by the 1970s, activists and the scientific community are coming together to seek action on climate change. Now, Gloucestershire has always been a hotbed of this kind of environmental activism, which is one of the reasons the Green Pledge project is taking place here. Now, on the slide, this clipping from The Forester describes a very ambitious garden project dreamt up by a group of school children from the early 2000s to transform Drybrook Quarry, which is near Cinderford, into a garden valley, a sort of where local wildlife and nature could thrive and visitors could learn about local geology and ecology. And there was supposed to be a waterfall over the Red Rock Terrace, which would be engineered so that there was a rainbow that would appear over a glass dome every day at noon. And it was supposed to have sort of hanging gardens and eco lodges and so on. And the idea was that it would rival the Eden project in Cornwall that had just opened the year before. So what happened? Well, it got quite a long way, and we have the plans from the feasibility study in our record, which I've put up here. But sadly, despite a lot of people's best efforts, ultimately it was deemed to be not workable, and the project was abandoned. But in its wake come dozens of smaller scale garden and growing initiatives, which I'm sure some of you will have come across today. So I think although it seems like a sad note to end on, I don't think it is. I think taking steps to address environmental issues can seem very overwhelming, especially when you're new to it, like me, and you wonder what difference you can make. But I think that project near Cinderford is a reminder that we just need to keep on generating ideas, and perhaps the answer is more to start small and local and build up from there. So I'm going to bring to a close there. Thank you for listening, and I'm very sorry for overrunning.
Thank you very much, Marion. That was fascinating. There aren't any questions in the chat at the moment, but if anyone has any, then please put them in now. But as there's not so far, we might begin wrapping up.
Yes, sorry.
So, no, that's all right. Don't worry, Marion. I really enjoyed that.
Okay, so if there aren't any questions, or if you want to send anything by email or pop anything in the chat, we can pick that up. We have got your email addresses, so we can get back to you. Just to flag up what's coming up next. So our next sort of kind of mini open day, it's the afternoon of the 3rd of August, called Bees, Trees and Teas. The talk on the cultural values of trees has actually already sold out, but the rest, there's another talk, Tales from Sussex Farm, the film screening and the document viewing and the cream teas. Those parts are all still available, so do please come along to that. And then the next Secret Reveals talk will be on the 28th of August, and it's called Remember, Remember, and they'll be revealing the many and varied rebellions that Gloucestershire has been involved with. I would like to add to that, if you have small children or grandchildren, we are running from on Thursdays in August, all bar the last Thursday, family activities linked to the Green Project. So those will be 10 till 12 on the 1st, the 8th, the 15th and the 22nd of August. They're drop-in, you don't need to book, and you'd all be very welcome. Thank you very much.